I'm Marek Chodakiewicz. I run the Kosciuszko chair in the Center for Intermarium Studies here at IWP. We appreciate your support. Today I will talk about the Soviet Union and Israel, so the Soviets and Israelis, in the light of the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist campaign in People's Poland, where the communists, or Polish ethnic communists, I call them Homo-Komuna, purged their former bosses who happened to be communists of Jewish origin. Usually, the Poles are so fixated on themselves, they don't understand it's actually connected to other things than Poland. And it goes deeper than just the Israeli victory in the Six-Day War. So, first I'll tell you about the Bolsheviks and their approach to minorities. And then we'll speak about the foundation of Israel and Israel's drift toward the United States and the West. This was not automatic. Who hated the Tsar? Okay, I'll give you an anecdote. A relative of our neighbor assassinated Tsar Alexander. But before him, his name was Alexander Hryniewiecki. Before him, there had been other attempts by Narodnaya Wolia, a terrorist organization. And in a particular instance, the Tsar survived, other people died, this was at a park, and the police, the ochrana, the bodyguards, captured the assassin. And the Tsar approached him and said, "Voulez-vous polonais? Are you Polish?" He was a Russian this time. But eventually the person who got him was Polish. So, who hated the Tsar? Well, the Poles, generally speaking. Who else? Well, anybody who disliked autocracy. In Russian secret police documents, and even in everyday parlance, oftentimes in hardcore pro-Tsarist newspapers, you can find the following phrase: the enemies are Poles, Jews, and students. It was synonymous when you said Jew or a Pole or a student with a revolutionary. So my white Russian friends and step family always told me that I was responsible for the Bolshevik Revolution because we hated the Tsar. I kid you not. One time, an aunt of mine from South Africa, Princess Pamela Kantakuzan, step aunt, of course. In the emigre family, everybody's an uncle and an aunt. So, wrote the family saga, the Kantakuzan saga. And she ripped into Jews. I said, well, these are unwarranted stereotypes. She was a lady of a certain age, so she came from a different era. Her husband, late Prince Misha Kantakuzan, was a page boy of the Empress Dowager. They were really dinosaurs. The mind frame, however, was preserved. And she wasn't even Russian. She was Scotch-Irish from South Africa, but she married a prince. So she would write things the way she internalized it from all the white Russian tales. And I said, well, this isn't really fair, and I can give you a bunch of books. So she called another aunt of mine and said, "Is the boy Jewish? I thought he was a Chodakiewicz." She called Maiko Sheremetyev, Countess Sheremetyev. So Maiko tried to explain to her that it's good to be fair because then maybe other people, except for me, who's a historian who reads everything, and I was then in grad school, I was in my late 20s, other people would read this. Not just Bielin and not just White Russians. And by this I don't mean Belarusians, I mean the reactionary monarchists that I love and admire. Okay, so minorities tended to detest the prison of nations that Russia was. Period. And minorities were overrepresented in revolutionary movements, in various revolutionary parties. Hardly anybody likes to research that, but the gossip is that it was the minorities, in particular the Jews, who were responsible for the Bolshevik Revolution, who ran the Cheka, the secret police, and then continued to do so. Well, this was mostly because there was no access to the archives in the Soviet Union. That's number one. Number two, it also served the left well to prevent any research and stigmatize research into minority participation in revolutionary movements, because then the crimes of Bolshevism, of communism, would never come out, and they could be stigmatized as Nazi. Oh, so you're interested in the composition of the secret police? You're an anti-Semite. What? I thought the head of the secret police, the founder, was a former Catholic Polish nobleman. And if you look at the composition of the secret police, there is some truth to what the White Russians would say to me, that it was all foreigners, meaning Poles, Jews, Hungarians, Latvians. You have no idea. Two entire Latvian rifle divisions joined the Cheka. They didn't just disintegrate. In the Far East, there were Chinese and various others who had a gripe against Russia, against the Russians, against Orthodoxy as the dominant religion. So it's quite natural. And then you start poking around in the archives, you look at various statistics, you hear things like, oh, almost 40% of all secret police supervisors as late as 1936 were Jews. Okay, so you freak out because you think, wow, that means the Jews were responsible, because almost 40% is an astonishing figure in relations to the percentage of the Jewish population in the Soviet Union. But then you poke around and you see, oh, they mean like 32 people. Why? Secret police attracted the most pathological element, and it was self-selected. So once you study it, you see, yes, we're talking about scores of people, maybe hundreds. Not hundreds of thousands, not millions. But for 70 years nearly, the left, including in academia, stigmatized any research, which would have exonerated the Jewish people, but it would have exposed the pathological leftist bunch of volunteers who wanted to mass murder, because that's what they like. Also, they wanted a good life at everybody else's expense. So nobody wants to talk about it. But I have news for you. The Jewish minority more or less was treated like everybody else. At first, the Soviets paid lip service to what Terry Martin called the affirmative action empire, which meant that the Bolsheviks attempted to ingratiate themselves with the minorities, and they allowed forms of minority culture to persist. They called it it's going to be, say, Polish or Ukrainian or Belarusian or Tajik in form, but the content would be Bolshevik. So nationalist in form and a socialist in content. That was the slogan. Of course, it was disingenuous. They meant to wash everyone's brains under the guise of pretending to be friendly to everybody, including Jews, Poles, or whatever, other minorities. there were. The synagogues were destroyed equally with churches. There was no mercy. Oh yes, you'll tell me that the head of the bezbożnik, the atheist society of the Soviet Union was formerly Jewish, or you'll bring up something else similar. Yeah, remember the Soviets, the communists postulated a radical break with the past. You cannot talk about a Pole, because a Pole or a Ukrainian or anybody else is a continuity from the very beginning, 1,000-year-old continuity. The communists proposed a break, and a new man who couldn't be Polish possibly. He could speak Polish, but he had to sound like Stalin or Lenin. What kind of a Polish or what kind of a Jewish thing it is? Anyway, those of you who are interested, there isn't enough work, but you could read an old book based on the Smolensk archives by Merrill Feinzel. He concluded that the godly, meaning the Jews, were just a tiny embattled minority by the 1930s. Everybody else was sucked in, including the pathological fringe in the secret police. Fringe! And others who decided to be secular and forget about anything that their families ever were. Because communism was about paradise on earth predicated upon a radical break with tradition and history. Okay. The Soviets allowed for dreaming. That is, at one point there was a proposal floating around in Moscow that there should be some kind of a Jewish republic established on the Crimean Peninsula. Instead, the Soviets founded the Republic of Birobidzhan, where they essentially deported Jews. And Jews never were a majority there. And they suffered, for the most part, like an average Soviet citizen. Terry Martin says that if you were Polish in the Soviet Union, you were 16 times more likely to be persecuted, terrorized, or killed than an average Soviet. If you were Jewish, you were about average. He says less than average, but what does that mean? Does it mean that, 3/4 of you goes to the Gulag, or half? Nobody cut Jews who are not Bolsheviks or who are not pathological any slack, except in propaganda. In propaganda, Stalin said anti-Semitism is just like cannibalism. There was law against anti-Semitism. If you were branded an anti-Semite, Stalin even told the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which was of course spin, that you would be punished with death or maybe Gulag. Yes, people were shipped to the Gulag for anti-Jewish jokes. That's true. Why was there an animus against anti-Semites? Why was there a law against anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union? This is very simple. Stalin, Lenin and then Stalin hated competition. And the competition said this: the communists want to mobilize our own people against themselves, and they promise through class struggle to exterminate our upper middle classes. And that is a part of a Jewish plot, where the Jews are both communists and capitalists. So instead we are going to preach, Nazis and others, we're going to preach race struggle. Capitalism is Jewish, said Adolf Hitler. And not only, he was repeating Karl Marx's "An der Judenfrage." Until the end of the 19th century, it was the most popular text of Karl Marx, almost as maybe more popular than the Communist Manifesto on the Jewish question, where Marx ripped into Jews and called them capitalists and hucksters, and he said Jews infected Christians with greed and capitalism. Other socialists, logically, married this to social Darwinism and racism, and voila, Hitler had the whole thing cooked up. He didn't invent it, he just plagiarized it. In Vienna, by the way. Okay, that's why Stalin pretended to be a friend of Jews, because he hated a narrative which would undermine the class struggle of the Marxists. Instead, he castigated and attacked the race struggle narrative of the National Socialists, which, as Mr. O'Brien told us, was another leftist ideology. Okay. The Jews were not persecuted as Jews unless they were stupid enough to reveal their Zionist sympathies, and they were silly enough to advertise the religious adherence. They were sent to the Gulag, unlike, say, the Poles, for transgressing against whatever the communists disliked in the Soviet Union. Anyway, none of this is well covered by historians. But I'd like to read to you what Stalin told the Jewish Telegraphic Agency in 1931. National and racial chauvinism is a vestige of the misanthropic customs characteristic of the period of cannibalism. Anti-Semitism as an extreme form of racial chauvinism is the most dangerous vestige of cannibalism. Anti-Semitism is of advantage to the exploiters as a lightning conductor that deflects the blows aimed by the working people at capitalism. Anti-Semitism is dangerous for the toilers, for it is a false track which diverts them from proper road, meaning from Hitler and his Nazis, and leads them into the jungle. Hence, communists, as consistent internationalists, cannot but be irreconcilable and bitter enemies of anti-Semitism. In the USSR, anti-Semitism is strictly prosecuted as a phenomenon hostile to the Soviet system. According to the laws of the USSR, active anti-Semites are punished with death. Now, in the West, of course, this was perceived as love towards the Jewish people, which further strengthened the stereotype that Jews were communists. This is totally stupid. Obviously, Stalin manipulated his Jewish interlocutors and the whole of public opinion. What can be more obvious? He didn't give a damn about Jews. I could, again, invite you to another talk about Stalin and Jews, but think about this. When the Red Army entered Auschwitz, have you ever seen the movie from that event? There's a documentary. Women with funny headgear were carrying Jewish orphans in their arms and rescuing them. Nuns, Catholic nuns. Have you ever heard about that special NKVD division which consisted of Catholic nuns? No, because the Red Army was not briefed what Auschwitz was. The NKVD had known all along. They didn't care. They were simply marching west. When the Red Army reached Theresienstadt, which was a showcase, German concentration camp, where the Nazis invited Red Cross people from Switzerland, so the prisoners looked half decent, the Red Army raped Jewish women who were there. If you think I'm kidding, go to the US Holocaust Museum archives. It's covered up. Why? Because Stalin was the great liberator and he was in love with the Jewish people. That myth still persists in many places, in particular in academia. In any event, Stalin had plans after the war. He wanted to take over at least Europe. But Roosevelt had promised him the United States would withdraw exactly like it had in the wake of World War I. So Stalin pretended to be moderate. He agreed to so-called coalition governments, which were fake coalitions, everywhere in the conquered Central and European countries. He agreed to fake free press, fake elections. This was all a show to reassure the Americans so they would leave. But the Americans were tardy. They were confused, and finally they decided to remain. How do you undermine America's resolve to stay in Europe? Well, try to exacerbate the crisis that impacted Western Europe in particular in the wake of World War II. This is where the Americans were. Do you know that people died of starvation in the Netherlands in the fall and winter of 45? Did you know that Bishop Graf von Galen preached from his pulpit for the Germans to steal food and coal, otherwise they were going to die of starvation? That's 45. Everything was a great mess. If it hadn't been in Western Europe for the United States armed forces, there would be nothing to eat. The Americans were feeding people, they were fixing things up. The Brits were bankrupt. The Brits mostly got stuff from us. I'm not even talking about the French, because it was a horrific situation. So Stalin decided to undermine the presence by destabilizing. As usual, the communists pursued a duplicitous policy. On the one hand, they encouraged and condoned coalition governments in Western Europe with communist participation, or at least with communist blessings. On the other hand, they undermined and subverted Western Europe. One trick was to do what? Foment pogroms, to cause a wave of refugees, Jewish refugees, to head west and strain the welfare resources of Western European states and American charities. Do you know where the first pogrom broke out? Kiev, September 1945. As Comrade Lenin used to say, comrades, spontaneity with us is organized. Then it spread to Hungary, where the communists were agitating against so-called speculators, which was a byword for Jews. And it was Matyas Rákosi, who was a communist of Jewish extraction himself, who rabble-roused in one of the most depressed towns, mining towns in Hungary, talking about how the working class was hurting because of the speculators, and everybody got it. So there was a pogrom there. Then the pogroms spread to Slovakia. There, allegedly Jewish doctors were sucking blood out of children. There was a kind of inoculation campaign, and everybody really freaked out. And there were pogroms again. Next, there were pogroms in Poland, in a variety of ways. Does this mean there was no anti-Semitism in Kiev or in Kielce or Krakow? No, that's not what I'm saying. But when you have a garrison town in Kielce with NKVD, Red Army, Polish Communist Army, secret police, how can you stage a pogrom that lasts for hours? Why would the police cordon off a small area? Pogroms are usually really, or should, except those organized by the secret police, are very spontaneous. In any event, that's a topic of another lecture. But what is interesting is whether it was Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Poland, 100,000 people out of Poland alone, surviving Jews, many of them returning from the Gulag, were allowed to cross the Iron Curtain. That's at the time when friends of my family and our relatives tried to get out from under the communist occupation in vain. Somehow, if you were Jewish, the secret police looked away and you could go. There was a confidential agreement between Jakob Berman and leaders of the Jewish community. Almost all of them left. Only crazy people, whether Jewish or Christian, would like to stay under communism. Yes. Only crazy people. Patriots too. That which means, unfortunately, most of my family, except the ones who already had been in the West because of the war, in the armed forces in the West. The Jews, 150,000 people, maybe 200,000 from all the satellites were permitted to go to the West to undermine the social net. That's what Stalin was hoping. He also wanted them to go to Palestine. Well, most of the Jewish refugees headed to America, but some of them went to Palestine. Do you know why? To make trouble for the British. There was a Jewish uprising, Jewish terrorism. That's where the dual bombing was pioneered at the King David Hotel. Yes. The Soviets hoped and counted on the Jewish state to become a People's Republic, their satellite. And guess who was the most vociferous in support of Israel? Not the US State Department, they didn't want Israel. If it were not for the fact that President Truman personally was a dispensationalist, meaning an evangelical Christian who wanted the gathering of the Jews in one place, there would be no Israel, because everybody at the State Department hated the idea. Almost everybody. The military didn't care, we weren't there, the Brits were there. So Stalin hoped to see a People's Republic and an uprising against the British. There is an essay on it. I have it as a footnote in one of my books a long time ago, but recently there's been an essay in Canadian Jewish papers describing Stalin's intents, including creating impossible, horrific conditions. Was there property restitution in Poland or elsewhere? No, the communists hated private property. Why would you want to stay if everything that you ever had was taken away? That's not the end of the story. Great Britain, because of this immigration problem and violence in the Middle East, began collapsing. It begged the United States to take over Greece and the Middle East. So we did. We stepped in. The United States helped everyone against communism. Now, it is really interesting to know that some Israeli institutions were studied with not just pro-Soviet individuals, but also Soviet agents. For example, Israeli intelligence was established by the NKVD. There were three factions. NKVD, labor Zionists, and Zionist revisionists who hated the communists. Eventually, most of the NKVD defected, and they said, we're Jews. Now we're at home, so we're staying here. This is late 40s, early 50s. Those who did not defect were discovered by the Israeli intelligence, and they were put on trial. Now, most of American intelligence community distrusted Israel. Only when the Israelis supplied some crucial political documents from Moscow in 1956, via Warsaw, by the way, did Jim Angleton, the head of CIA's counterintelligence, change his mind. And a closer collaboration developed. The Israelis were inching towards the West because, as I said, the government was mostly leftist, labor Zionists, and infiltrated. Only the Zionist revisionists who were in the opposition had any sympathy for the West and hatred of the communists. Only them. Eventually, the Israelis began acquiring American arms, first French. We were still offended because of the Suez Crisis in 1956, where we backed the Egyptians against France, Great Britain, and Israel. But eventually, a relationship developed very slowly. It was parallel to the Soviets embracing Arabs and dumping Jews as allies and contacts in the Middle East. The Soviets built Egyptian fortifications in the Sinai. Everything the Egyptian army knew was Soviet made. New, I mean, strategy, tactics, operations. The weapons were Soviet too. As the Soviets were courting Arabs, the Israelis began talking to the United States. Before 1968, most of the Western Israeli cooperation, as far as the military and intelligence, of course, was surreptitious. The Israelis were not going out of their way, oftentimes, but they saw that being pro-Western was in their interest. I'll give you one example. As a progressive Jewish state, Israel reached out to Africa. Israel invited African foreign students and established good working relations with very many emerging African states in the late 50s, early 60s. The Soviets and the Chinese had their fingers in Africa too. At one point, the Israelis resolved in the Congo to support Mobutu Sese Seko. They trained 2,500 commandos, paratroopers, in Israel on a rotational basis. Those guys came back and became Mobutu's presidential guard. They wiped out all the opposition, including Lumumba and other pro-Soviet figures. That really upset Moscow. Those things were going on surreptitiously. Hardly anybody knew what was going on, but the CIA took note because the CIA should have supported Moses Chombe. Instead, the CIA supported Mobutu Sese Seko. There were instructors from Israel, not only mercenaries, like my commanding officer Rafal Gangonovich, who fought in the Congo. That really upset the Kremlin. And the Kremlin began investing more in, if not outright anti-Israeli activities, but indirectly anti-Israeli activities. Moscow blessed the Arab National Liberation Movement. It wasn't only in Yemen, but the Soviets would support a harebrained scheme to reverse the Jordan River away from Israel by Syria. Yeah, the Israelis bombed them, so it didn't go very far. Nonetheless, it had full Soviet support. The Soviet Union began in the 1960s increasingly criticize Israel in the United Nations. It In 1965, Marshal Grechko came to Egypt and signed a full military aid deal. This was followed up by a visit by Alexei Kosygin, again a Politburo member, an important person. And whatever you say, bless you, it was aimed at Israel. It was aimed at Israel. That's how Jews perceived it. And they were getting very antsy. In particular after 1966, when Moscow and Cairo signed a military alliance treaty. That's how it was portrayed. And the Soviets got 2 naval bases out of it. At the same time, the Egyptians were squeezing Israeli shipping everywhere. Eventually, in '68, it came to a full naval blockade. The Soviets were also very active in Syria. They convinced the Ba'ath Party to admit communists as cabinet ministers. It looked like Syria was going to go Soviet. Sure of Moscow's support, the Ba'ath Party or its military attacked Israel in the border area. It sponsored numerous raids, not to mention that the Soviets indirectly at that point were supporting Palestinian Farians against Israel, and there were raids, constantly raids. In April 1967, Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Yakov Malik warned Jews that defending themselves from the Arab aggression, I quote, they are risking the loss of their state. So lay down and shut up. And then you can be acceptable, so long as the Kremlin calls the shots in the Middle East. At the beginning of May 1967, the Soviet Politburo issued an instruction to its ambassador in Cairo to convey information to the Egyptian government about an alleged mobilization of the Israeli army and its readiness to start a war on the Syrian and Egyptian border. The same information was conveyed to the Gulf, so Saudi, etc. This was this information. The Israelis wouldn't mobilize until May the 20th. There were no troops at that point, Israeli troops. The Soviets were feeding the Egyptians this information. So Israeli diplomacy, foreign minister Abel was his name? I forgot. Eban. Yeah. He went to Paris to ask the French to contact the Soviets to stand down. The Israeli prime minister delivered the most craven, pacific speech. This was not a trick by the Israelis. They just didn't want war. This was mid-May. Washington, here, they came to Washington, D.C., and the Americans said, well, maybe we'll try to put together some kind of an international naval force to relieve you, because the Egyptians were blocking Israel in the south. There was no trade. But then the Americans admitted, really, we can't do much for you, so you're on your own. When Nasser closed the Tiran Strait and Aqaba, the Gulf of Aqaba, that was it. That meant strangulation, economically speaking, for Israel. That was it. This was May the 23rd. So the Israelis decided that the that the Soviets, that the Egyptians and others meant business. Well, plan maximum naturally for the Soviets was to destroy the Jewish state, or at least incapacitate it and reduce it to some kind of a puppet of nothingness. But I don't think the Soviets counted on plan maximum. Instead, they wouldn't have minded getting rid of an American satellite, because that's how they viewed Israel, with Arab hands, but they didn't count on it. They weren't sure that the Arabs were capable of doing it. Instead, I think there was a plan minimum in the making, namely to introduce and maintain an atmosphere of permanent danger. So the Arabs would always rely on the Kremlin, and the Kremlin would be the great dealer of cards in the Middle East, pushing out the United States. So influence in the Arab world was the key. Influence. But the Soviets miscalculated. The 6-year war broke out.
6 days.
A 6-day war broke out. And the Israelis cleaned the Arab squad. It's unbelievable how much it upset Moscow. It wasn't just that their clients were bested, but their weapon systems, their fortifications, their tactics, operations, whole strategy was exposed as inadequate.
50th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution.
Inadequate. Yeah, to add insult to injury, this was the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Jews rained on Moscow's parade. In Poland, people loved it. I'm serious, they used to say, our Jews beat their Arabs, which obviously upset Polish communists to no end. Okay. I'll backtrack a little bit. On February 24th, 1967, Izviestia published a little tiny note informing that he was about 60 years old at that time, maybe 58. Salomon Borisovich Dolnik confessed that he's an Israeli spy. That's February 1967. And there was nothing else. Which would have been natural, because the Soviets hardly ever revealed tiny stuff like this, that there was an Israeli spy. This guy actually was a Zionist sympathizer. I think he had been labor Zionist before the Bolshevik Revolution, and he returned to his ideological roots, and he traveled around the Soviet Union. So he'd go to Minsk, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and somewhere else, meet with some friends from the Jewish community and say, oh, Israel's great. That was before the war or anything else. That we shouldn't be living under communism, we should go to Israel. Dolnik was his name. And when he saw a grave desecrated at a Jewish grave, at the Moscow cemetery with a swastika, he took a picture and he passed it on to the Israeli embassy. That's why he was arrested and was sent to the Gulag. I forgot, 3 years, 5 years in the Gulag. But it was not in the paper. It was just a footnote to tweak the nose of the Israeli embassy and Israel. Nothing important. Except it became important. Suddenly, after the 6-day war, on August 4th, 1967, Sovietskaya Estonia opined to make, I'm translating, so bear with me, to make his bosses rejoice, the bosses at the embassy of Israel, Dolnik cut out a fascist swastika from a block of paper and he put it on a negative of a photograph to besmirch the Soviet Union. And they went into the gory details of how bad Dolnik was. Why? 6-day war. The next day, Sovietskaya Latvia, even bigger article, Dolnik becomes, I don't know, a Frankenstein monster. They resurrected him. And they talk about him spying, Israeli agents infiltrating anything. And this is what Sovietskaya Latvia wrote on the 5th of August. Very important. Israel and Jews are international Cosa Nostra with a common center, common program, and common funds. Which means the Soviets resurrected the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Poor Dolnik again, he would have been a footnote had it not been for Israel's victory in the 6-day war. He suddenly became the most important part of the global plot to take over the world. Please note the escalation of invectives in 1967. And please note that the Soviet press, by enhancing the Dolnik case and emphasizing it, created a paradigm which would surface in Poland in March, resurface in Poland in March 1968. Same story, Jews, Zionists, funds, they were all spies, etc., etc. In other words, this was made in the Soviet Union. I'll just give you a couple of other examples of the so-called Zionist plot. On October 2nd, 1968, Literaturnaya Gazeta unequivocally stated that Edward Goldstucker, who was a literary critic in Czechoslovakia, was a Zionist who infiltrated the Communist Party. It's not Poland, it's just a pattern, a propaganda cliche, which was projected anywhere because at that point the Soviets were really upset with Israel, having suffered a huge defeat. In Izviestia on August 23rd, 1968, there was an article unmasking three Czech agents, I quote, 3 Czech agents of the International Zionist Organization joined. Joined is a charity organization, but they were obviously a part of the Kabbalah. It turns out that a periodical, people who worked for the periodical back then, Jews in Eastern Europe, established that none of the alleged Zionist agents was Jewish. They were just some low-ranking people. On September 3rd, 1968, Izviestia outdid itself. It basically wrote that the Czechoslovak foreign minister, Jiří Hayek, was not only a Jew, whose real name was allegedly Karpeles, but he was also a Gestapo collaborator. Actually, he was a pre-war leftist who spent the war in a German camp. And not Jewish at all, but it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. He was in a German slammer between November 1939 to May 1945. Why was he a collaborator? Well, he survived, so he had to be a collaborator. Amazingly, I mean, I could go on and give you more examples of craziness. but all of it was based on similar arguments. For example, the narrative of Polish communists defending themselves against the Zionist fifth column, and they righteously cleansed the party from agents and aliens who had infiltrated the Communist Party. Identical arguments appeared, for example, in Sovietskaya Bielorussia on July 18th, 1968. Kremlin made, as usual. That's what the Comintern used to do. The Politburo said, this is the narrative, you spread it everywhere. This is exactly what happened. From July 1967, an anti-Jewish campaign was unleashed in the Soviet communist and friendly media. The Soviets also allowed a podium, a bully pulpit, if you will, to people like Torofin Kichko, who wrote a book, Judaism без приказ, which more or less means Judaism exposed, or without any accoutrements.
Without borders?
Without embellishment?
Embellishment, yeah. So he was proclaimed to be a genius of national atheism, even though the book was published in 1963. He got an award in 67, of course, in October. And the award ceremony, which took place in Soviet Ukraine, was covered by Komsomolskaya Znamya on October 1967. Other people like Yuri Ivanov, who wrote Caution, Zionism, essays on the ideology, organization, and practice of Zionism, lectured on a lecture circles openly. This was published in English, published in English as late as 1970. You'll find all the theses and all the stories there. How Jews control the world, and the Zionists are funded by Jewish bankers here, there, and everywhere. Now, this is not to deflect anything from Gomułka and Polish communists. I'm just telling you that the campaign, anti-Semitic campaign in the party and state apparatus would not have been possible without the blessing of the Kremlin. General Moczar, who was the face of the campaign, he was a protege of people who led the KGB, including Andropov, by the way, who would eventually lead the KGB. But I would like to tell you what Moczar said at a Central Committee plenum, and he wrote it down. In 1948, he said, the Soviet Union is not just our ally. It is what we say to the Polish nation. For us, the party man, the Soviet Union is our fatherland. And I cannot tell you what our borders are, for today they're in Berlin, and tomorrow perhaps on Gibraltar. And he's considered to be a Polish nationalist. This guy who was a son, not only Orthodox, but the son of a Tsarist gendarme, just because he got rid of the Jews. What kind of a nationalism is that? This guy was in the Communist Party of Poland, who denied Poland's right to existence before the war. This guy was a border GRU agent between 39 and 41. Then he was in the communist underground, which negated Poland's right to existence. And then he became a secret policeman. He was a stooge of Moscow. Alexander Shelepin, Siemić-Jasny, Vladimir Siemić-Jasny, and finally Yuri Andropov were his bosses. Not Polish nationalists, who were usually under 6 feet, or in London, or somewhere else. Yeah. They dominated the secret police, and and they wanted to get rid of their former bosses and others and take over. That's the story behind 1968. A bunch of thugs acting on the prompting of Moscow and with Moscow's blessing maneuvered themselves to the top, hoping to win communist power struggle using anti-Jewish rhetoric to accomplish it. I have news. In 1956, similar people, including them, used anti-Jewish rhetoric to bring Gomulka back and to rally the masses in that power struggle in 56. It didn't work out because other communists used disingenuously anti-Soviet rhetoric, which flew. The Poles liked that. They didn't buy the narrative that the Jews were responsible for Stalinism and everybody else was honky-dory. Okay. Until this very day, there is very little realization, in Poland in particular, how the anti-Jewish campaign of 1968 was connected to a long-term Soviet strategy in the Middle East and its failure because of the war which Israel won. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yep.
My question is there, I heard also from my father, which is that, and I don't know whether this is true, that Jakub Berman met with Stalin in 44, 45, I'm not saying, and make a rule that in the administration in Poland, government, there must be either Jew or person who's married with Jew. That's my question, whether this is true.
No, I've never heard about anything
Okay.
like this, but I can tell you
Because
something similar.
Yeah.
Namely, Zofia Gomulka, who was herself of Jewish origin, complained that the party leadership keeps sending as party apparatchiks Jews with bad looks and Jewish names. Change the names.
no, I know that. I know
So that's the only thing I can tell you. The other stuff, unless your father was present at
He
the
was
meeting.
leaving. No, he was leaving. He was leaving at the time, you know. I mean, he
I
was
know,
alive.
but there was a lot of gossip. Unless you go to the archives and show me a document, then you know, I can tell you.
I'm asking
a lot of
to
stuff.
that's not my question.
No, I understand, but no, I've never heard about it. Go ahead, please.
I seem to remember studying years ago that Stalin was into ethnic groupings. Didn't he create either an SSR or some sub-province of Jews? But it was way out in Siberia.
I said Birobidzhan. They at first they considered Crimea, and then they switched to Birobidzhan.
Which is way out in Siberia.
Yeah.
It's on the Amur River.
Yes. Fun! Let's have the Jewish state in Siberia.
Was it an SSR or something smaller?
I think it was an autonomous region.
Autonomous region.
Yes. Birobidzhan. Yes, ma'am.
Are the Russians responsible for the anti-Semitic, uprising in the United States?
Oh, you mean Russian influence operations? Russian influence or Soviet influence operations have been around for a very long time. For instance, the Soviets attempted to incite Black Panthers. The KGB, I think, planted a bomb at a black church in the early 70s. There was also some monkey business at synagogues to put the Jews and the blacks at the loggerheads. I don't have I have documents, KGB documents from the 70s, but what's going on now is people don't change. They have a certain modus operandi, and the Kremlin really likes monkey business. Why? Well, so we would have problems. But anti-Semitism has been with us since times immemorial, and some people know how to play it, how to excite everybody, and they take advantage of it. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the case of Professor Stefan Stelzin? He was the leading Polish expert on Ethiopia, and I was told this by one of my professors who was an Ethiopianist, and what he said was Stelzin was a communist, but he was also Jewish, and as a result he was forced out and he wound up going to Britain and teaching there in 68, 69.
There was a wave of immigration after 1968. I think altogether by 75, around 14,000 people left. And they were welcomed with open arms, partly because the West did nothing during the Holocaust to help the Jews. So they welcomed the immigrants of 1968. But as far as Ethiopia, I can tell you that one of leading communist journalists in Poland, Kosciuszko, was a GRU asset. And a friend of mine, Ermias Sachle Selassie, the grandson of the emperor, picketed the Communist Embassy of Poland after Kosciuszko wrote a book about his grandfather, besmirching it. So I don't know about that particular professor and what kind of an expert he really was, but Kosciuszko was no expert. He was just a manipulator and influence peddler for the GRU. Yes, sir.
Well, having spent a lifetime
Long time no
studying
see.
these subjects off and on, let me pose my question this way. How do you evaluate Solzhenitsyn's study, 200 years, Russian Jews?
I wish there were 200 monographs on the topics he brings up. Also, he is an amateur historian, so sometimes it reads like a novel. Professor Richard Pipes liked it, and he defended it publicly. As I said, I wish it had been researched, and I wish there had been researched more thoroughly. I wish there had been more scholarly work. But I think it's a vast improvement over what we used to have. Almost nothing. Yeah. Okay. Yes, ma'am. So it'll be the last question because our wonderful staff is sacrificing a Saturday. I don't want them to hate me more than necessary.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm trying to think, domestic war and foreign war, there are some similarity, and I just wonder how many versions about attitude toward Jews, or how Russian they don't like Jews, or German they don't like Jews. Just how many versions are there? I heard a minute. Are there any other versions who like Jews? So there's a kind of contradictory.
I mean, remember, the Jewish people have been around for thousands of years. It's an ancient civilization. It's sort of like asking who dislikes ancient Egyptians. I don't know.
That's my question. So I just wonder if there's a conflict existed, what's the cause?
I don't know if they don't like Jews now in Germany. I don't know if they dislike them in Russia. I hear stories, but I haven't conducted. And I'm not talking about Washington Compost and New York Times stereotypes, because every other day I hear how the Poles hate Jews, and the Poles are getting more and more surprised because most of them have never met a Jew in their life. So I don't know.
And you mentioned if you want to do something, go research the record. The problem is those records, or maybe some even witness or testimony, they are all false or misleading. So how do you come up with some research?
There is a fair amount of records always, which may be misleading. Alois Hitler's mustache is everybody's favorite topic. But there were scholars like Dr. Greengrads or the Dean of Holocaust Studies, Raoul Hilberg, who said witnesses are so traumatized that they inevitably embellish. However, he read 3 million pages of documents regarding Germany's actions, and he said, I read about the Germans killing Jews, French collaborators, Dutch, Belgian, Scandinavian, so Danish, and others. He said Croatians, Slovaks, etc. He says, but I never found anything about the Poles. And that's the founder of Holocaust studies, Professor Raoul Hilberg. You have to learn how to discriminate when you read documents. Even falsified documents can tell you something if you know how to look at it. You see what I mean? I don't care what kind of a document it is. If you are equipped with a methodology, then you can tackle such problems. I'm completely not worried that there may be many falsifications. I mean, I'd rather have the smoking gun, but the smoking gun arrives in the form of 40,000 documents you read, because then a picture coalesces in your head. It doesn't have to be, oh, here I am. I'm really transgender. I'm just looking this way because it's my day.